Okay, so we finished up Unit 1, and I think that at least all but maybe one or two of you successfully got through the quizzes and did your discussion postings. And I will get to grading those. It generally takes me a week to get through all of the grading, and this week is crazy with meetings and such. So just be patient. I will get through them. As a reminder, the scores that are computer generated for your quizzes are not accurate. Okay, so don't be concerned if you see you have a 40 or a 50 or a 35, something like that on your quizzes. It can't grade the short answer essays. I have to do that myself. So until I grade your short answer essays, the quiz grades that stand there are not accurate. You'll know when that happens because I write comments. I write comments with the short answers, and I write a comment overall on your quiz. So if you see you still have something like a 40 or a 50, it's not because you got a 0 on those short answer essays. It's because I haven't gotten to your quiz yet. So just be patient, like I said. So we're going to be going into Unit 2. So for Unit 2, you have 2 chapters of the Colonial Latin America textbook. You have Chapter 3, which is on colonial administration, and you have Chapter 4, which is on labor in the colonies. These are chapters that in some ways can be a little dry. It's going through political structures and where the political structure came from, who was from Spain and Portugal, from the peninsula, and who was from the colonies, and how it was supposed to work. But this is really extremely important, these 2 chapters, because if you think about it, they had just accomplished a conquest of an area that was vastly larger, size-wise, size and scale-wise, than their home countries. And they had to rule over these populations that were much greater in number than not only the populations they were sending over to settle, but in some places almost larger than the populations they even had back in their home country. So all of a sudden they have, these nice little enclave countries in Europe, and they have to figure out, how are we going to administer these huge, vast lands? And initially, the idea was that they would send over peninsular representatives who would rule in the colonial empire. They would be the viceroys, they would be the members of the audiencias, of the colonial courts, that they would be the gobernadores, the governors, and therefore they would have their loyalty to Spain. They wouldn't be loyal to the colonies. But after a while, not so many wanted to go. And that became problematic. Part of the reason not so many wanted to go is because the number of Indians was decreasing and the crown stopped giving encomiendas. So that's why the next chapter, labor, is so important to understanding the establishment of the colonies in Latin America, because labor and how to harness that labor and make money from the labor became really significant in developing the populations of colonies. And so they went about these things in different ways. Spain, once not so many people wanted to go for colonial administrative positions, and they got themselves into a situation where they were going bankrupt, began to sell political offices and sell them primarily to criollos, which are pure-blood Spaniards born in the Americas, and even to what they called native sons, or radicados, people who had a great loyalty to the region in which they lived and in which they were administering. That worked well for Spain to make some money for a while, but it wasn't such a great plan when you think about, oh no, now these people have loyalty more to the Americas even than they did to Spain. But it worked, because it helped them to keep control in a way, to make a little bit of money. And these were people who had a vested interest in harnessing labor and in making money for themselves and for the colony. In much of Spanish America, they relied very heavily on both Indian labor and on the labor of the mixed bloods, sometimes called mestizos, although mestizos were specifically Indian and Spanish mix, more often called castas, just the castes, so those who were of mixed blood. In Portuguese Brazil, they began to rely much more heavily on slave labor. They had a much more difficult time harnessing the labor of the Indians there that were more non-sedentary or only semi-sedentary Indian. They didn't have large imperial societies. So they began to import vast amounts of African slaves in order to work on sugar plantations. And this was true also in parts, primarily also in the Spanish Caribbean. So this is what we're dealing with in these chapters, is looking at how the crown was able to administer and how they were able to establish control, and then how they harnessed the labor to create at least somewhat successful colonies. How they did this through encomiendas, through repartimientos and mitas, which became labor drafts that would evolve later into debt peonage, or if they used slavery in these ways. Another important aspect of these chapters is the role of the church in colonial society. And you'll see there's a difference, a split almost in the church. You have those who were called the secular clergy and then the regular clergy. And the secular clergy would be like the parish priests, people who had a parish over which they administered, usually more than one church, because you're talking about areas that are spread out and more remote. So a parish priest might administer to many towns and villages, but they had home churches. Then you had the regular clergy, which were the monastic orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and what would become the most significant one, which were the Jesuits. And these were ones that had usually vast properties. They would establish sometimes just monasteries. Other times they would establish what were really more aldeias, they called them in Portugal, which were vast properties where you would have a church and a monastery. You would have land that you're administering. And they were more closely tied to the indigenous population. So extremely significant within the colony. So in addition to these two chapters that you're reading from colonial Latin America, you have 4 chapters, 4 sets of documents from colonial lives. And these tie in with the readings. The first 2 are on the church and the others deal with labor issues. So they tie in with the readings that you're doing from the chapters. So 2 of those, and this is clearly spelled out in the homework module, 2 of those are going to be included in part on the chapter 3 quiz, and 2 of those will be included as part of the chapter 4 quiz. And then of course we'll have our discussion forum. I'll create that prompt in the next day or so for having a discussion on this. You also need to be working on figuring out what you want to do for your research paper, what your topic is going to be. Some of you are already surging ahead with that, and I think that's fabulous. This is wonderful. You want to start gathering resources, paying attention to what those requirements are for those resources. If you haven't been thinking about it, make sure you go to the research module. There's a list of possible topic ideas. It's not by any means an exhaustive list. There are so many things you could do as research topics, but it just gives you an idea of directions that you might want to take your research. So by the time this unit is due, which is Sunday, February 15th, you need to make sure you take the Chapter 3 quiz and the Chapter 4 quiz, that you make your primary discussion forum post and respond to at least one other student, and that you also post in the research discussion forum what your research topic will be. Part of the reason I want you to do this and in the discussion forum for research is I want you to be able to look at what other people are researching, and you can help each other out. Ask each other questions, get ideas from one another. This can be an ongoing discussion about our research as well. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. So let's get started with Unit 2.